Hi, Lee. Welcome to our show.
Hello, Savannah. Nice to see you today.
How are you feeling about today?
I'm feeling great about today. It's a beautiful morning. I was up early again with my cup of coffee on the front porch before watched the sunrise, and it was a great morning.
Was that like 4:30 before?
No, the sunrise is late right now. It's like 6:15.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
I ran at 6:30 and I didn't realize I was so close to the sunrise.
Good for you.
Who would have thought?
Just get a little earlier.
Well, we're sitting this way at the moment together because we have an amazing guest, which I'm so excited about. This is Erin Calipari.
Hi.
Welcome, Erin.
I'm here.
Welcome.
Yeah.
I'm so excited to have you. Erin, I have your bio here and I'm going to read it in front of you and you're going to have to just embrace all of it.
Okay.
Okay. Dr. Calipari is the director of the Vanderbilt Center for Addiction Research and an associate professor in the Department of Pharmacology at Vanderbilt University, right down the street from us. Her work focuses on understanding the neural circuits. I was about to say neutral circuits.
It's okay. Close
Neural
enough.
circuits. It's the brain.
The brain.
Hello. That govern motivated behaviors with particular attention to how these circuits are altered in addiction and psychiatric disorders. She is known for her interdisciplinary approach, integrating behavioral, molecular, and circuit-level data to create comprehensive models of brain function. Over her career, and I really love this because I'm all about awards, she has won many prestigious awards, including the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, which we love, from the White House. What did that feel like, by the way?
It's actually really funny. So the way I found out is the White House just like puts out a press release.
Okay.
And so somebody texted me and was like, "Hey, congrats." And I was like, "On what?"
Yes.
And then they just sent me the link to the White House's thing. And I was like looking at the names and I was like, "Oh, I am on there. That is amazing." And so they basically pick scientists who've kind of made a contribution to different areas. And so then I was looking for my friends and texting them and being like, "Hey, just so you know, you're on this list."
Did they send you a plaque or anything?
They did eventually, but that
good.
came much later. It was just like a random press release in the night. And then in the mail was just like, "You did this." And I was like, "Thanks."
I kind of love that. It was so low key. It's like from the White House.
Yes.
Okay. And you have published over 100 peer-reviewed research articles and reviews on these topics. In her role as director of the Vanderbilt Center for Addiction Research, she is leading a large group of faculty, students, and staff as they work together to understand the brain and the factors that confer risk to addiction. Through targeted outreach, the center has made an impact in the local and national community by educating the public on the science of addiction. Erin, we're so happy you're here.
I'm so excited to be here. This is kind of what I love doing. It's just
Okay.
chatting with people about what I'm excited about. It's like every academic's dream, right?
It is every academic stream. And I always love being in the center of these conversations with very smart people. And you're definitely one of them. I'm so excited. So we normally start the show by reading reviews, which we won't do in front of you. Instead, we're going to talk about, are you reading or watching or listening to anything lately?
Okay, I'll start this with like a full disclosure that my job all day is reading and writing and meeting with students who have these like deep ideas about the world. So when I go home, I enjoy like consuming media that I am not always thinking as deeply about. So right now I'm like watching, I'm catching up on Euphoria is the thing that I've been watching.
As
so
you
it's
should.
interesting to me. And so that's my thing of the week.
But it does feel related to your work.
Yes. Actually, I mean, everything essentially is related to my work.
That's
if you
so
think
true.
about, like all of these shows have drugs, even drinking, smoking, you start to look at patterns and how they represent these people and kind of how it fits in and how much of it is it a central storyline of a show or how much is it just like a given thing. I mean, you think about like these shows where people are having meetings and everyone's drinking wine or negotiating over whiskey and you just see how normalized some of it is. And so I find that fascinating from a different perspective. But
Yeah, it's
so
like
a nice way to make my viewing TV sounds educated.
Yeah.
It is educated and educational,
Yes.
as we love. Lee, do you have anything that you've been into lately?
We're season 4 now of Slow Horses.
I'm so proud.
And I finished Flight of Passage, which is, Erin, you haven't heard me talk about this, but it's about a 17-year-old and a 15-year-old brothers who make a across-the-country flight on their own in a little 1943 Piper Cub in 1966.
Oh, yes. I remember loving Piper Cub.
It's amazing. It's an amazing story. So on one of my other adventure books that I just finished.
Amazing.
Yeah. You?
Yeah, Slow Horses is incredible, and I'm so happy you're already on season 4.
Yeah,
You're blazing through that.
Blazing through, yes.
I just finished reading. This is for real brain rot of a book, but it's Julia Fox's memoir called Down the Drain. Do you know who Julia Fox is?
No.
Okay, Erin, you know.
I do know who Julia Fox is. I feel like that could be some like studying for this evening.
Yeah, Julia has actually, yes, a ton of addiction and drug use, etc. in her history, which is fascinating. But she famously dated Kanye West, who I do think you know.
Oh, yes.
Yes. And she called herself Kanye's muse. That's what kind of propelled her into the public eye in any way.
Yeah.
Yeah, so she was really interesting. Did I read anything life-giving? Probably not. I think that's all I've read lately. And that's on that. And I've been watching The Handmaid's Tale.
Oh, The Handmaid's Tale is good.
Isn't it so great?
The
Still never
Testaments is out
watched it.
too, which is the one that comes after. That's another one I'm watching that's pretty good.
And I'm trying to blaze through Handmaids to get to Testaments because I've heard it's really good.
It is, yeah.
So I'm very excited about that. So some dark things in my world. I probably need to lighten up.
Yes.
Yes, indeed. Okay, on that note, let's start the show. Welcome to the Subtext, where we go beneath the headlines and beyond the obvious. I'm Savannah Locke.
I'm Lee Seacamp.
Hey, if you like the show, here's your official permission to gas us up. Follow, rate, and drop a review wherever you're listening now. Give us 5 stars if you're feeling generous, and we might even read it on the show. You can watch full episodes on YouTube and Spotify and stay connected on Instagram at The Subtext Show, at Savannah_Locke, and at Lee C. Camp. Got thoughts or questions or hot takes? Send them our way in the DMs. Okay, Erin/Lee. This is what got me thinking about addiction and why I wanted to talk to you is because of the show, The Pitt.
Yep.
Have you seen any of this?
I've seen some of it. I'm not like religiously following the show, but I've seen a good amount of it.
Then you know the vibes.
Yes.
And Lee, have you seen The Pitt?
I saw the first 2 episodes.
What happened?
The woman whom I love, who I live with,
Yes.
wasn't into going on to see episode 3.
Too
I think it was
graphic?
a little too much for her. Yeah.
Yeah, it is fairly realistic.
Yeah. So I told her again last week I would like to go back and watch The Pitt, and she said, I don't think so.
Okay, so The Pitt has been like my favorite show over the last couple of years. They just finished the 2nd season, but it is very graphic. So if you have like a queasy stomach, it's probably not for you. Yeah. With all the blood and whatnot. But one of the storylines that's overarching from season 1 into season 2 is actually a storyline about addiction. So in brief, it's about a doctor named Dr. Langdon, played by Patrick Ball, who was very high functioning, the best doctor in season 1. And at the end of season 1, it comes out that he had been stealing patients' benzos and he had a benzo addiction.
Yeah, is he the main doctor?
No, the main doctor is this guy. Dr. Rabinovich on the back of my computer, thanks to my husband. And he has this conflict, though, with Dr. Rabinovich, who is his like supervising doctor. And he basically was like, this hasn't affected my work. I'm doing amazing. Like, it's not an addiction. I just started whenever I had this surgery. Like, look at all the stuff I would do if I was an addict. Would I be able to do that? And at the end of season 1, you're thinking, like, what are they going to do with this person and how are they going to treat this story? And then in season 2, you kind of see some like rehabilitation and him being able to work again, etc. So I thought this is a really interesting look that challenges some stereotypes around addiction. And then I go on God's internet and I'm like, who specializes in this? And I find you right down the street from us because you actually specialize in addiction and a lot of your public facing work, at least, has been around stereotypes around addiction. So I want to title this episode, What We Get Wrong About Addiction.
It's a lot. But we get a lot of it right. I mean, I think, addiction is kind of, I think we've gone through different eras of how we see people suffering from substance use disorder. And I think that before the opioid epidemic came around, I think it was really easy to say, oh, well, those people, right? Those people with substance use disorder, they should have made different decisions. Oh, look, they can't do X, Y, and Z. They're a problem. And then the opioid epidemic came around and people started realizing that it was their sibling, it was their parent, it was their neighbor, it was people who were really close to them. And then I think you start to, when it's somebody who is in your life, you start to see that the people aren't just like, it's not that they don't care, it's that they want to stop and they can't. It's that some of these people didn't start using drugs to get high. They were prescribed it by a doctor. And so then I think the cultural kind of, I don't know, like view of it started to shift. And they started to say, okay, well, not everybody is just kind of recklessly doing drugs and this is how they get here. A lot of them, it was post-operative pain management, and they weren't educated on what the consequences or risks were. And they weren't told that it was addictive. And now we have these problems. And so I think now there's this shift in the conversation where people are open to seeing these kinds of stories, because I don't think that they really were. Now they are, and you're starting to see better and better representations of them in the media. There are people who are high functioning, who are great at their job, who maybe have a problem with benzodiazepines or alcohol. And then you start to say, okay, well, this can be a problem in different ways because, okay, that's a problem for him as an individual, but it also is a problem for all the patients that were impacted by, you know, his actions as well. And so then you start to see addiction as, who is it harming? Well, it's the individual, but it's also all of these other people around. And so I think it's an interesting portrayal, because usually in those shows you see like the patient coming in to the emergency room asking for drugs, and that's how they've been shown, not the doctor themselves, which is interesting.
So before we go forward with, there's so much there to explore, but let me step back to your comment about used to be that people weren't open to having these kind of conversations because they thought about it in a different sort of way. What would you say were primary variables to the social and cultural history that saw addiction primarily as a matter of willpower?
Oh, you know, it's kind of hard to think about why people thought that. I think some of it is media. I mean, you had, if you really go back and you think about like the conversation, I mean, an interesting one is around marijuana use, right? And you had kind of films like Reefer Madness. You had programs like Dare that were there to kind of scare kids away from doing drugs. You also have the war on drugs, which we did not win. And so you start to think about like how the government was viewing drug use and its implications. You thought about how we were approaching kids to say, hey, drugs are bad. And I think there's been a shift in the conversation about like how would you win this war? And you start to realize like it's not by just preventing drugs from being sold, because people get them anyway. And it's not from telling kids don't do drugs, they're bad, because they're going to do them. So how do you educate them? There's also all of the kind of interesting things around science, and vaping has been a big thing that's come up. And I think there was a lot around marketing of vape products and flavorants. And so there's been a lot of lawsuits around, you know, who are these products being made for, and how do we educate parents and the kids themselves about, like, are we selling bubblegum vape flavors for a 50-year-old? Or are we selling that to a teenager? What is the impact of these flavorants on how addictive these drugs are? And so there's just like, I don't know exactly kind of how we got here, but there's been kind of a lot of moving parts, all of which I think people started to realize, well, this isn't working.
Right.
This is not what I was told. There must be something else. And so they're open to kind of information. But the question is, where are they getting the information from? And it really is now starting to be put out there, but it's not easy to find.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Can I do one follow-up? I mean, because it's interesting to think about like the war on drugs. You know, I think there's lots of evidence from what I know about that you've got the Nixon administration that pushes that because of they're wanting to alienate blacks, and they're wanting to alienate the peaceniks in the Vietnam War. And by the war on drugs, they can in one fell swoop do this sort of bigoted kind of move by the Nixon administration. And then at the same time, I think, which you didn't mention, but from my perspective, you have a lot of stuff in theological traditions that rightfully or wrongfully, well, I think wrongfully, but rightfully or wrongfully in the interpretation of what happens, I think that there's this sort of implication that sin is equated with a bad choice. And it's a matter of voluntary willpower, which is actually a horrible way to interpret sin theologically. There's much more interesting ways to talk about it. But to me, those are just huge factors in all of this, and the other kind of cultural things.
Well, and the willpower thing is tough, right? Because I think you look and you think with your own perception, because we center ourselves, right? We say, oh, well, I would just stop. But the entire disorder is that repeated drug use changes your brain
Yes.
in ways that make it very difficult to stop. They, like when you think about this, most people have heard of dopamine, and it's a molecule in your brain that helps you learn things. And so I think a lot of times we talk about it as a reward molecule, but it's a little more complicated than that. It's really important in helping us learn about things in our environment that are important. And what drugs do is they increase dopamine. So they're artificially telling your brain, this is important. And so what's happening is things associated with drug use, like, I don't know, like paraphernalia, or you can think about like you go to a bar, the signs and all of these things, your brain is learning about those being valuable to somebody. And drugs are essentially pharmacologically engaging the system in a way that's way above and beyond normal. So now what you've done is it's not just about the drug. It's, people can take drugs and not become addictive. So it's not that drugs themselves are addiction. Taking drug once doesn't mean you're addicted.
Yeah.
It's this process by which you're taking them repeatedly and it's changing your behavior. And so the whole kind of fundamental aspect of addiction is that it's not that easy to stop. And so I think people are starting to learn more, whereas as information is available about how this is kind of complex and how do you help people. Well, it's not by just being like, hey, stop. It's by helping them redirect behaviors to things that are more adaptive. It's by, intervening in different ways and providing support. And we don't have a magic bullet treatment. So how do we do that? And so I think when you think of it that way, then you start to be more open to saying, okay, well, maybe this is more complex than I thought. And I think that's where we're starting to shift to this conversation. It's not like we're 100% there and everyone's like, yeah. And it doesn't mean that your behavior doesn't still harm people.
Right.
Just because there's, you know what I mean? So
Yes.
I think that that's the complex part still, is someone says, well, that person still harmed me, and that's true. And so how do you kind of navigate helping people now? And that's, I think, still a challenge.
With an integrative and multifaceted approach.
Yeah.
Okay, because I've read a ton of your stuff over the last week and watched literally every video on the internet of you.
I don't know if that's good. I mean,
no, it's
good or bad.
But something I was interested in hearing more about was the research that you've done with animals.
Yeah.
To learn more about volition.
Yeah.
And can you explain what volition is for normal people?
Yeah. So essentially, you're making a choice to do something. And so, if you think about studying drugs, I kind of touched on this, is that you can take a drug, right? And that's not addiction just because you had one drink. And so what we study is the difference between what a drug does, like the pharmacology. You take a drug, what does it do to your brain, and how your choice to take it over and over again is represented in the brain, and kind of what is changing that's making drugs such potent motivators of behavior across kind of different environments. And so we use kind of, you can't do a lot of these studies in humans because you really need to understand the nuanced aspects of this. How do you know what's going on in the brain when you're doing this? And so we're doing a lot of recordings where we're recording dopamine, and we're recording dopamine with very, very high resolution. So we can record dopamine, on a sub-second time scale. That means we can get hundreds of recordings every second of what the dopamine levels are at a specific time while, a subject is doing something. So the question is, like, when they see a cue associated with a drug, what happens to their dopamine system? As they take drug, what happens to their dopamine system?
By cue, you mean like when they see
a light,
a sign, or
yes.
a restaurant or something?
Yeah,
like,
so
could it be anything?
For a person, the cues are just things associated with something else.
Okay, nice.
So for a person, it could be the needle they took the drug with, or it could be a plate or spoon. It could be the sign that's associated with the bar. It could be a specific kind of glass they drink their drink in. For animals, it's usually a light or a sound or something to mimic that. We can go and say, well, what does dopamine do to each of these things? And then you can start to compare it to say, okay, maybe we have some signal associated with drug, and we have another signal associated with food. How does addiction change how they respond to these things? And so your brain will respond to both. But when you've had a lot of drug and you're very motivated to get drug, now the brain response to the drug cues are much bigger than to the food cues. And so we're looking at how it just shifts how you're making decisions. Like, how much do you value taking drug over getting food, over social relationships? And so it's really about, like, understanding addiction at a deeper level. Is it just that you want to take drug? Or is that it's also fundamentally reshaping how you view other valuable things in your life so that those aren't as important, so that what you're preoccupied with is, how do I get drug? You don't value the negative consequences associated with drug use. You don't value alternatives as much. And so then if you can understand the kind of dysfunction that happens, how can we start to shift that balance back to something that's adaptive?
Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated with, and I'm a hack in this area, so correct anything that's grossly wrong. But I remember reading a study about the Olds and Milner, these guys.
Oh, this is like one of my favorite studies. I'm okay. See, we're in the weeds
I
now.
love it. No, get in the weeds.
No, but these weeds are like, I tell my students this stuff all the time when we talk about dopamine and pleasure and happiness and all that kind of stuff. But as I remember the story, at least one of these two guys was not a good didn't have a good lab skills, and he put a probe in and was it rats or mice?
Yeah, I think they've done both, but I think that original study was probably rats.
Yeah, and so put the probe in maybe the wrong place, and they thought they were testing for something else, but they stumbled upon dopamine.
This is how they found out that dopamine drives behavior.
Yeah,
they were putting so the way your brain communicates is through kind of electrical signals. It's like electricity. So you can actually put electrical wires in the brain and stimulate, and it causes the cells in your brain to fire. And so that what they were doing was putting these probes in, and they were asking the question, will an animal press a lever to stimulate different parts of the brain? And so they were saying, will you stimulate your cortex? Will you stimulate here? And what they found was that when they hit the dopamine neurons, these animals would press and press and press at very high rates. And so they basically were like, well, what's going on there? And this is how we found out that increasing dopamine is something that really motivates behavior.
People,
yeah. Well, and I go in and tell my students about that stuff. And then I say, as I remember the stories as well, that they got kind of gross with these tests. I mean, they ended up, would have one that would just punch the button, even have food there sitting next to it, and it wouldn't eat the food. Yeah. And it would just keep hitting the dopamine stuff and then just kill over dead. Or then they would take a grid that they electrified between them, and they would have to hit the lever here to get the dopamine hit, and then run across this grid to push the button down there to get another dopamine hit. And so they would just run back and forth. Then they electrified the grid.
And they still do that.
And they would burn their feet off going to get the dopamine hit. And so it's like, that's what's going on in our brains when we have this overdriving, overwhelming urge and crave. It's like, it's things in your brain that are happening.
Okay, so 2 questions. The first
I'm sorry, I
is,
just love that this paper got brought up. I bring this up in the lab, and it's one of my favorite papers. It's like
I love it.
It was like the beginning of this field. This is how it started. It's really, really
incredible.
Cool. Yeah,
it's dark, but that's good. Yeah. Okay.
Wait, one more quick follow up on this. So sorry. But I do remember when I was like a rookie faculty member, quite a few years ago now, reading a study about a study going on at Vanderbilt, and I'm remembering for decades plus ago, but as I remember hearing about the study, you all were testing on dopamine levels in the lab, and the test was, okay, let's test dopamine levels when you eat chocolate, when you have an orgasm, and when you have cocaine. And that was so I used to tell my students, like, eating good chocolate's like bad sex, and really good sex is like a bad hit or something.
It's like a bad hit.
Yeah. But it's just the chemistry of it is just so fascinating.
Yeah, it's interesting. And so it's like a lot of fields to be able to record it, right? You have to know the chemistry. You have to be able to do, you have to understand psychology. You have to understand animal behavior. You have to understand all these things. And that's what makes science so fun. And then you have to be able to relate it to the who cares.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Why does somebody care you're doing this?
Care? Yeah. Which the visual of running across the electrical grid is pretty traumatizing.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great reason to care for sure. Okay, so 2 things. One is what is happening in our cells that is making us make these choices to run across an electrical grid. And if it is true that humans also do similar things. And then B, have there been any sort of progressive therapies that have helped rewire, undo some of the damage that can be done to that?
Yeah. So this is, okay, so humans do a lot of the same behaviors. The reason that these behaviors are so, 1, they're important to study, but 2, they're so I don't want to say easy because science is hard, but that they're easier to model in a lab is because these are like fundamental behaviors. Like if you think across all organisms, what do they have to do? They have to eat, they have to reproduce, they have to be motivated to do things, otherwise they won't. And so these systems in our brains are conserved across basically all species. And you see the same kinds of responses. You can get flies to self-administer alcohol. They'll actually consume it. So they're like, this is like across all species, right? And so I think it's one of those things that you get these conserved behaviors. When you look at humans, they become a little more complex, right? When you're thinking about, an animal, you have a grid floor. If you're thinking about humans, you're thinking about like what is an aversive consequence to a human. It could be you might lose your job. It could be bad decisions at work. I mean, going back to the Pitt, you're thinking of somebody diverting drugs. That's a massive risk for a doctor, right? But you're so focused on getting access that you're not really weighing the consequences of your actions the way that you once were. And so it's really kind of about how it's reshaping how you make decisions. And that's really the important part. Does it reverse? I think there's been a lot of brain imaging studies in people that when you are abstinent for long periods of time, it does start to normalize again. So you do start to get kind of normalized behavior, but it's really hard because there's other factors other than just, your dopamine system has changed that go into drug use. You think about stress, right? People often relapse. So they might be abstinent or successfully abstinent for years and they still can relapse. And a lot of times it's around stressful events. So you have all of these things that are really shaped because again, you're stressed, you remember drugs, it basically makes you feel better. So you have all of these things in a human life that are not quite the same in some of our model organisms that become so hard to control for, right? People do really well with abstinence if they're removed from the environment they're in, right? If you put them in rehab, you put them in another state, people actually are pretty good at staying abstinent, but then you come back to the same stressors, managing all of these things. And so it becomes really challenging. And so when you're thinking about, how do you recover? I think that's one aspect. These GLP-1 drugs are actually starting to be a really big conversation. So people were taking them for weight loss and they started reporting like, hey, I don't want to drink anymore. And everybody's like, wait a minute, does this work for other drugs? So now there's a lot of ongoing studies that it looks like it works for a lot of compulsive type behaviors where people are not really always updating their actions based on an outcome, right? You do the behavior with no thought about what the consequence of that action is. That's kind of like a compulsive behavior. You keep doing it. It looks like for some people it works. And so this might be one of those big breakthroughs that we've had that we haven't had anything like this in a long time. And so it's, again, none of these things are going to be a cure. Like you take it once and all of a sudden you're completely cured. It's going to be a tool that helps people along with all of these other, getting in a better environment, getting a support system, like really working on sobriety, like that I think, but again, we're in an interesting, exciting time, but we don't have all the answers right now.
Yeah. Did you know about that GLP-1 stuff?
Yeah, I've heard a bit about that, which is interesting because there's I'm fairly familiar with a lot of the recovery literature, AA and Al-Anon literature, and I remember there's something I don't know if it's in the big book or where, but they'll talk about how if there ever was a pill that they could take, that they would, right?
Yeah.
But they thought that at that point that there wasn't. So I've always found that really interesting that there might be these kind of treatments. I want to go back to one more question about kind of the powerlessness kind of piece of this before we talk a little bit more about interventions or helps. So years ago, I heard a physician, and he was saying the analogy that he used to help people understand powerlessness over this stuff. And so I would love to hear from your perspective if this is a fair enough, helpful metaphor analogy. He said, look, if you're drowning and you're underwater and you know if you take a breath in, it's going to kill you. But at some point, your brain and your brain stem takes over and it makes you take a breath and it kills you. And he said, that's what's happening in addiction, is that if you take another hit or you do whatever it is, that it can kill you. but there's another part of your brain that takes over and you do it. Do you think that's a fair, helpful metaphor or analogy?
I think probably for some people, it's hard because like I've never experienced this, right? So I don't know exactly what the feeling is for people. And it's one of the interesting things about addiction is that it's a disorder that has a wide range of different kind of reasons and experiences. So when you think about like a genetic disorder, like you can say this gene went wrong and in every instance of the disorder, this gene went wrong or something like that. With addiction, some people started taking drugs because they had a lot of anxiety. Some people started taking drugs because they had a surgery or they have chronic pain. Some people started taking drugs just because they were trying to have a good time. And like all of these things, they led to the same kind of outcome, but it doesn't always express the same way either, right? So, when you look at how you diagnose addiction, you have the DSM-5, and it's all of these different categories that you can have. You need some cluster of these kind of markers, and some people have some and not others, right? Some people may not be dependent on the drug, but dependence means that if you stop taking the drug, you'll have withdrawal symptoms. Okay, well, with opioids, most people who stop taking it have severe withdrawal symptoms, but stimulants don't really cause severe withdrawal symptoms. So that means that some addiction has that as an aspect, some doesn't. And so I think, it's hard because I think that is the experience is that people, again, they kind of know they don't want to be doing it, but it then takes over and motivates them. But it's different for different people, and what's motivating them and when and why and how is really different. And that's what makes it so hard. It's not like we have one patient. We have a range of different patients, all with different experiences and comorbidities. And we're trying to figure out, do we need to treat a comorbid depression, right? It becomes really hard not to take drugs if you're depressed when you're not taking drugs. And so, it's just, psychiatric conditions are so challenging because they are so different. They have similarities, but there's just such a big range often. And men and women experience a lot of these things differently.
That's my next question, and I'd love for you to talk about that because in one thing that you had done, your research found that men and women can exhibit the same addictive behaviors, but the underlying pathway is completely different. So talk me through that difference.
Okay, so like I'll try to think of let me think of a good example. So like if, let's say, the goal or whatever the end point is that you want more dopamine to be released in the brain. Well, you can get more dopamine released by increasing how much dopamine is made. But you also could have dopamine hang around longer by preventing it from being broken down or being cleared. The end game of both of those pathways is more dopamine for longer. But one happens because you start making more, and the other happens because you stop breaking down dopamine. And so I think a lot of times when you see some of these psychiatric disorders, you can get to the same end, like depression, anxiety, but the way that you got there might be through a different molecular pathway, right? So there's some overlap in some process in the brain, but maybe these grouping of signaling molecules are what's driving it in one group and these in another. Who cares? I always ask my lab this when they give me some like really in the weeds detail, like who cares? Why should we care about this? Well, if you're trying to make a drug for somebody that reverses the dysfunction that leads to that outcome, now you need to know all these little details of, is it this protein or this gene, even though the outcome is the same. And so one of the interesting things is that when you're looking at big data, when you get a lot of data on different topics, a lot of times you'll see similar behaviors and sometimes you see different behaviors too, but in male and female subjects, but the underlying molecular changes might be slightly different. And so I think we're doing a lot now looking at how things like hormones, like different kinds of hormones influence how drugs work. So women are a particularly vulnerable population. They often transition from first use to addiction faster. They have more problems with abstinence. They relapse at higher rates than men. There's some evidence, although we just, I think recently started collecting enough data to start making these conclusions, that there's some evidence of like hormone cycles influencing craving and things like that as well. And so there's a lot of interesting things there where you're seeing a particularly vulnerable population. And that's not to say that there can't be some men that also are particularly vulnerable. It's just saying as a whole, women have some extra factors that can influence how drugs work, which makes them different.
So with regard to slowing down the breaking down of dopamine so the level stays higher, is that any behavioral thing or is that just purely chemical?
Okay, so the way that stimulants like cocaine works is dopamine is released from cells in your brain, and the way you terminate the signal so it doesn't last forever is through these things called they're called the dopamine transporter. It's my favorite protein. Tell everybody they have to have one. It's kind of like a vacuum cleaner for the synapse. So it's just a protein that actively sucks dopamine out of this extracellular space, and so you release dopamine. The dopamine transporter sucks it up, and that's how you stop the signal. So it's just not like dopamine forever. What stimulants like cocaine do is they actually block that protein. So what
They block the vacuum cleaner.
Yes. So now you get dopamine released as normal, but it can't be cleared. So it keeps dopamine, each time you release dopamine now, it starts to accumulate more and more, and then it stays around for longer. So that's how cocaine works. But then you have drugs like opioids, and what they do is they actually prevent the dopamine cells from being inhibited. So those cells, how much you release, there's other cells that are like, hey, slow down. And what they do is they take those cells offline. And so now you get more dopamine. Both of them can be addictive. Both of them are reinforcing, which means that animals will lever press or humans will seek them out. But they increase dopamine through different ways of doing that. Who cares? I mean, it's interesting for a few ways. If you want to stop them from doing it, you need to know how they work.
Yeah.
But that also means that there's different changes that can happen in your brain when you're taking them over and over again. Opioids are acting on mu receptors. These receptors can change. The inhibitory cells can change. The dopamine cells can change. You know, if you're looking at stimulants, the amount of the dopamine transporter, the vacuum cleaner can change. The cells can change how much is there to try to compensate for this. So you get different changes in the brain that happen with different drugs. And so that's another part that becomes really challenging to figure out, you know, how are we treating them? How much do they overlap? What's going on there?
What about behavioral inputs to addiction or behavioral addictions as opposed to drug addictions? Do you study that much?
Yeah, I study. So one of the things that I'm really fascinated.
So just to be clear here, we're talking about sex, shopping,
gambling is a big one. This is actually going to be
we talked about gambling a lot.
Gambling is going to be a big one with sports betting and things going online, the apps on your phone. There's a lot of social media is actually a big thing. People are talking about a lot. Social media addiction. There have been a lot of lawsuits about social media companies using actual historical psychology work to create their apps to make them more engaging.
There are neuromarketing programs at several very prominent schools in the country that study this stuff. And they know very well what they're doing to you.
Yes. And I think so that to me is really fascinating. So my lab study is kind of things that make dopamine be released. And so again, we talked about like, you know, it's not just things that are good, it's also things that are important. And so what you start to see is that when things are unexpected, like just something's interesting, dopamine goes up, right? So like think about the fact that humans will just like watch fireworks, right? Like there's no like inherent value other than, oh, that's neat and unexpected and I don't know what's coming next. Dopamine increases to things in your brain that are just like a light that's presented randomly, a light that you can control. So you have an animal pushing a button to turn a light on, that will increase dopamine.
Especially just novelty generally.
Yeah, exactly. And so a lot of what we study is kind of different things that influence how much dopamine is released to novel stimuli. And so I think a lot of the kind of gambling, a lot of the kind of those kinds of addictions, if you want to call them that, are really driven by these kind of same processes. It's just a different way to like engage like novelty. If you think of slot machines, like you have all these flashing lights, you have these things, they're kind of unpredictable, they're a little bit predictable. These are the ways to get the most dopamine out. And now you're linking that action to something interesting and it happens over and over again. And so those I think are a lot, I don't know that they're a lot harder to treat. I think they're all kind of equally difficult, but they're just so fundamentally different because we don't often think of them because it's not a drug. And so I think it's taken people a little time to kind of come around to the fact that like gambling is an addiction or you would have a sex addiction or a food addiction. And so I think that's like a conversation where people are starting to kind of look deeper into that. And again, those GLP-1 drugs are really interesting because it looks like it kind of could actually have positive effects on some of those, but it also makes people lose weight. And so if you're overweight and you have a food addiction, okay, but what if you're somebody who is taking stimulants and you actually have a very low body weight and now you're trying to use a drug that lowers your body weight more? And then what are the health consequences of that? So I think there's a lot of research to be done on kind of using these kinds of approaches and drugs to understand kind of what makes drugs unique. And or maybe they're not that unique. It's really just dopamine dysfunction that's leading to these problematic behaviors.
Oh my gosh, you're literally so fascinating. I could ask you a million questions. But talking about how basically what I'm hearing you say is that like some of these things haven't really been explored because they're not like hardcore drugs or something, where if someone hears heroin, they're probably going to be thinking in one direction. But in another interview I watched, you said that nicotine and alcohol are two of the most dangerous drugs in our society.
Yeah.
But you basically talked about how we've collectively made them okay while stigmatizing others. Can you just talk more about that?
So when you go back into like the history of kind of drug, I don't know, our ability to regulate drugs, a lot of like some of our regulation has been political, like in nature. And so when you think of the like we have the drug scheduling system, which is Schedule 1 is like no approved medical value, right? But then you have drugs in there that are really like not that bad. I mean, I'm not saying they're good. I'm just saying they're not they're not as bad as drugs that you can literally buy at the store. And so, you know, one of when I teach classes, students always find this fascinating. I'm always like, oh, well, when you're thinking about drug withdrawal, which drugs are the most dangerous? And they always say opioids. But alcohol is actually one of the only drugs that you can actually die from alcohol withdrawal. And so you have seizures. And so when people are dependent on alcohol, you have to undergo withdrawal in like a medical setting. And so you have these drugs that are causing massive problems. Nicotine is also incredibly dangerous. And so you have these drugs and they're legal. And then you look at some of these other drugs and they're not. And I'm not advocating for legalizing all the drugs. I'm just, it's more about a conversation of like, well, how are we deciding what is okay and what's not okay? And a lot of it's just really complex. And so, you know, when you're thinking about like scheduling and how you can study these drugs, these decisions change how researchers get access to them. So if you think about marijuana, that is a Schedule 1 drug. In my lab, I have to get approval and I have to get the drug. Usually it comes from like the government or a supplier. And they're really controlling what that is. But if I live in Colorado, I can just like go to the store and buy it. But I cannot, because my research is regulated by by federal like laws. I can't, if I lived there, I could not go buy that and study it in my lab. And so now we also have this kind of interesting thing where there's drugs people are using recreationally, but researchers can't study those drugs in the form they're using them in the lab easily. And so there's kind of these interesting legal systems that make it really challenging to study drugs quickly as they come out and like how you do it. So it's just like I think there's a lot of interesting conversation to be had there on drug regulation and what's legal and what we decide is safe and what isn't and kind of what the impact is on people.
Yeah, no, that's so fascinating. Do you have any more questions? Because I have one more. So
I have loads, but you
dang
go ahead.
it. I know. I mean, literally, okay, I'll take the last
Yeah.
one. Are you sure?
Yep.
Okay, so something I wanted to ask was if you could wave your magic wand and you could educate everyone in Tennessee and or the country about this subject, what would you want to say in terms of maybe like policy or education around addiction?
That's such a hard question because it's like there's so many things I want people to know. You know, I my brain is going, I don't have a great way to articulate exactly what I want to say. I think my brain goes to where I actually care the most, which is educating parents and teenagers on kind of developmental periods and the consequences of taking drugs during those periods of time. So this won't be concise, but I try.
Please,
your prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until you're in your like mid-20s. And so a lot of these systems that the drugs are engaging are the same systems your brain is using to develop and form new synapses and reshape kind of how these systems work. And so, you know, one of the most critical periods is kind of these like middle school, high school age students. And I think our messaging around that historically has been don't do drugs, they're bad, instead of, oh, let us educate you on kind of what the consequences are so you can make informed decisions. And I think a lot of that would be kind of educating people on kind of what happens during that period so that there's information about kind of that being a really important time to really consider kind of what you're doing and what those drugs could do to kind of the long-term organization of your brain.
It's great to be with you. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
thanks
so
for the great
much.
work you're doing. We're appreciative.
Yeah, you're amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you.
you.